for US lawmaker Ilhan Omar. She's been ousted from a powerful House Foreign Affairs Committee. She'd caused quite a stir in India last year with a visit to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. In Islamabad, the battle to avoid bankruptcy continues. No word on the bailout yet. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif says the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is giving his country a tough time. Inflation in Turkey touches the 58% mark. President Erdogan is facing a difficult re-election this year. He has unleashed a wave of public spending to win his voters back. Apple's revenues and profits have declined for the first time since 2016. The company is blaming the supply chain disruptions in China for this dip. And after being towed around the Atlantic for months, Brazil has decided to sink its 30,000-ton warship into the ocean. Environmentalists are not happy. They say the ship is packed with toxic materials. The war in Ukraine is about to complete 1 year. The fatigue is setting in. Even the West is realizing its limits. The delivery of lethal tanks has not even begun, but Kyiv already has a new demand. It wants fighter jets, a demand that has swiftly been shot down by the West. Ukraine followed up with a new demand. It wants sanctions against India and China for buying Russian oil. The demand comes from a senior lawmaker of Ukraine. His name is Alexander Merezko. He heads the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine's parliament. He says he has lived in New Delhi and he finds India's oil purchases from Russia to be painful. Listen to what he says about India's policy, and I'm quoting. They should be consistent. This is a global conflict between democracy, the free world, and authoritarian regimes. There shouldn't be any compromise because of material economic interest. Merezko made this comment in Washington, D.C. He wants the U.S. to slap secondary sanctions on India and China. First, let's tell you why he's there in the first place. Merezko is on a mission to rally American lawmakers to keep their support for Ukraine going. Why was this necessary? Because public support for Ukraine has been slipping. America's assistance for Ukraine is under the lens. The blank check to Ukraine is being questioned, especially by the leaders of the Republican Party. Recent events have made the scrutiny necessary. A series of corruption scandals came to light. President Zelensky ordered a purge. 15 officials either resigned or were dismissed. So the Americans want to know where their aid money is going. Recently, some American officials were in Ukraine. A top official delivered a message to Kyiv. Listen to what he said, and I'm quoting, "The trip afforded us the opportunity to directly communicate American taxpayer expectations of transparency and accountability to the Ukrainian government." Will Merezko defend these corruption charges? Isn't this a case of material interest? And he spoke about the conflict between democracy and authoritarian regimes. So we ask, where does he stand on the issue of terror states, of states sponsoring terrorism? Because his government, the Ukrainian government, seems to have no qualms about doing business with them. In fact, let me tell you a story. In August last year, Rawalpindi was buzzing. A British plane had landed at the Noor Khan base. It was a military plane of the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom, the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And this wasn't the first time this plane was in Pakistan. The RAF, British Air Force, had been repeatedly sending planes to Rawalpindi on almost a daily basis. This is what reports said. So why did the United Kingdom send a military plane to Pakistan? They were not holding any drills after all. What then explains the frequent visits? The plane was on a mission. It was said to be picking up these.
Для ванни. І що, шипить хорошо? Коротше, дурня, тільки гроші тратиш. Боже мій, тобі удобно з такими котами, нігтями? Подивіться, що в неї за нігті. Наляпала собі там.
What are these, you may ask? Well, what you saw are believed to be Pakistani howitzer projectiles. They're now in the hands of the Ukrainian military, transported by the UK. Connect the dots and you'll know what the British military plane was doing in Pakistan, picking up Pakistani military supplies to be given to Ukraine. The UK government was sourcing shells from Pakistan. By early August, There were multiple reports. A UK Royal Air Force plane was caught making frequent trips to Pakistan. It was a C-17 Globemaster aircraft bearing serial number ZZ143. How many trips did this plane make? At least 12, according to one report. And with every trip, Pakistan entered deeper into the battleground in Ukraine. Pakistan became a supplier of munitions. And none of this is new. Some of you may be aware that this is an old relationship, nearly 3 decades old. Ever since Ukraine became a separate country after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it has had a military relationship with Pakistan. And at the heart of this relationship were weapons. Ukraine was the supplier. I have some figures to show how deep these ties ran. Until 2020, Ukraine supplied arms worth nearly $1.6 billion to Pakistan. In the 1990s, Ukraine sold over 300 tanks to Pakistan. The deal was worth $600 million, and it helped both the parties. You see, Pakistan needed weapons to carry out its state-sponsored terrorist activities, and Ukraine needed a buyer to rescue it from financial struggles. The deal with Pakistan saved a tank factory in Ukraine from bankruptcy. For Kyiv, Islamabad has been one of its biggest customers. Just look at how a Ukrainian state-run defense giant refers to Pakistan. They call it a strategic client, a country with quote-unquote high levels of trust and mutual understanding. That is how Ukrainian companies describe Pakistan. Clearly, the relationship ran deep. Pakistan depended on Ukraine for its weapon supplies. So when Ukraine was running out of ammo, Rawalpindi was happy to step up and help. And so I come back to the question, borrowing the words of this Ukrainian lawmaker who wants India to be sanctioned. Is this not a case of material interest? Will Ukraine call out Pakistan for its terror factories? Will it condemn the Pakistani military support to terrorist groups, those who have waged deadly attacks on India? Will it call out Pakistani generals for holding Pakistan's democracy hostage? Well, we are not holding our breath for a response. And we say neither should Ukraine hold their breath. Nobody is sanctioning India for buying Russian oil. Also, no one is rolling out the red carpet for Ukraine to join the European Union. They want it very much, the EU membership. But every time they push for it, Europe throws the rule book at them. They love sticking to process, apparently. So no membership just yet, no fighter jets either. But to show their commitment to the larger cause, Europe is happy to sanction Russia a little more. I'm not sure who's buying all of this anymore, but Europe is trying all it can. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is in Kyiv. She traveled by train. Symbolism, check. But what is she doing there? Attending an EU-Ukraine summit. Also telling Ukraine that the goal of joining the EU in 2 years is, well, ambitious. It will take time, and that is an understatement. Ukraine's EU candidacy was approved last June, but officials say the process to formally join could take decades. If you don't believe me, ask Turkey, now Turkey. Do you know when they became an EU candidate, Turkey? 1999. Candidates need to fulfill certain criteria before joining the EU. Turkey is still waiting, by the way. And tackling corruption is one of those criteria, which explains Ukraine's recent crackdown on graft. Just before Ursula von der Leyen's visit, Zelensky is trying to prove that he fits the bill. But it won't be so easy. The EU is walking a tightrope. It cannot throw out the membership rule book for Ukraine. At the same time, it cannot afford to appear unsympathetic. After all, billions have been spent on bolstering Kyiv's forces. Europe has done all of this while its own people suffer a crippling cost of living crisis. So how do you show support without giving membership? Europe is sending 2,400 electric generators to Ukraine. No, this is not funny. You want to join the club? Sorry. Here you can have a generator. Classic Europe. To be fair, they're also spending about $164 million to buy vital energy equipment. The EU says it will train 30,000 Ukrainian troops for combat. It will spend about $27 million to remove mines from what they call liberated territory. And the EU president has promised new sanctions on Russia. They're scheduled for February 24th, the war's first anniversary. Yes, it's been almost a year since Russia began this special military operation, that's what they call it, and it doesn't look likely to end anytime soon. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hopes it will end by next year. He has said, and I quote, "We must do everything we can together so that next year, on the first Thursday of February, we will be able to pray simply with thanks for the obtained salvation from evil." Well, that will have to wait. Right now, the fighting may intensify. This is Ukraine's warning. Zelensky says Russia is planning a massive offensive on the war's anniversary, and he's urging his allies to send more weapons. After much deliberation, tanks are on their way. The US is set to send 31 Abrams tanks. Germany and other Western allies are sending Leopard 2 tanks. Of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken note. He was in Volgograd on Thursday. The city's old name may be more famous, Stalingrad, the site of the bloodiest battles of World War II. More than 1 million people perished in the Battle of Stalingrad. It was a hard-fought Soviet victory against Nazi Germany, and it was a turning point in that war. Putin was there to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the battle's end, and during his speech he said, history was repeating itself. He said, "It's unbelievable but true. We are again being threatened by German Leopard tanks."
Невероятно, но факт. Нам снова угрожают немецкими
We are again being
танками
threatened by
«Леопард»,
German Leopard tanks.
на борту которых
Putin hinted at escalating the war. He said it won't end with the use of armored vehicles. In fact, escalation seems to be on everyone's agenda. Case in point, the United States. It is set to announce a fresh military package for Ukraine. It will pump in another $2 billion. The US has already spent more than $50 billion on Ukraine. The last tranche of weapons will include, the latest one will include GPS-guided bombs. These are bomb-tipped rockets with a range of about 130 kilometers. That's almost twice the range of the rockets fired from the HIMARS launchers. But here's the catch. The deliveries are not expected for another 9 months. What does that tell you? The West seems prepared for a drawn-out war. And they're fighting not just with the military power, they're also deploying their soft power to support Ukraine. The next Olympics will be held in France next year in 2024. The US says it supports blocking Russia and Belarus from these games. And Washington isn't calling for an outright ban. It says the athletes should not be allowed to represent their nations, but they should be allowed to participate as neutral individuals. The International Olympic Committee agrees, but Zelensky says there is no such thing as neutrality. Back to Pakistan, which is desperately trying to avoid bankruptcy. It is scraping the bottom of the barrel. Its reserves will last for barely 3 weeks, and now it may be staring at an $18 billion penalty. Iran has issued an ultimatum to Pakistan. The two countries were building a pipeline together. Pakistan has not been holding its end of the bargain, and now Iran is reading the Riot Act. Our next report has all the details.
They say when it rains, it pours. Pakistan is headed to destination bankruptcy. Its partners have put Islamabad on notice. Iran and Pakistan were building a pipeline for gas together. Project has ran into delays, and Tehran is running out of patience. It wants Islamabad to finish the pipeline or pay a penalty of $18 billion. The deadline for Islamabad is March 2024. Already, the project has seen several delays. The pact for the pipeline was signed 13 years ago in 2009. It is a 25-year-long contract. The pipeline would begin from Asole in Iran and end up in Pakistan's Multan. It was supposed to become operational by 2015. However, international sanctions against Iran derailed the project. In 2019, there were attempts at revival. The two sides inked a revised deal in September. Under the new agreement, Iran agreed not to approach any international court, but the time is running out. Tehran has now given a year to Islamabad to finish the project. Iran has already built its side of the pipeline, but Pakistan hasn't even started construction. Tensions were already simmering between the neighbors. One of the main flashpoints are tensions on the border. Pakistan and Iran share a 750-kilometer border. It remains tense. In recent years, border patrols from both sides have come under attack. The return of the Taliban in Afghanistan has added more friction. Taliban members have repeatedly clashed with Iranian border guards. Tehran has criticized Islamabad's support to the terrorist group. While Iran's relationship with Pakistan remains rocky, its ties with India are holding steady. New Delhi has proved to be a reliable development partner. Despite the pressure from the international sanctions, India has kept Chabahar port project going. In this year's budget, it allocated over $10 million or 100 crores to Chabahar. This is the same amount as previous years. Tehran is ready to take the next step in the partnership. In December last year, a report emerged. Iran has offered to sign a 25-year strategic agreement with India. Tehran wants to develop its transport and energy infrastructure. The agreement can open doors for Indian investment. Bureau Report, First Post.
Vantage continues after a short break.
Affairs, Victoria Newland. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you, Zaka. Great to be with you.
Let's start with the biggest ongoing clash that is between Russia and Ukraine. What is the U.S. assessment of where the war stands right now as we pull up on a year since it began? And the million-dollar question everyone's asking, how is this likely to end?
Well, Zaka, as you have said, it is almost a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been very brutal and cruel, and not simply on the battlefield, but we also see Russia attacking civilian infrastructure throughout the winter. What they can't win on the battlefield, they're trying to win by freezing Ukrainians and cutting off the water, but Ukraine is standing strong and is fighting back hard. We and our allies and partners in the 50-some country coalition that supports Ukraine have understood that Russia could end this war any day if it stopped fighting. So if Russia stopped fighting, the war would end. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And so, as you saw when the President and President Zelensky met in Washington in December, the Ukrainians are committed to continuing to try to fight for their land, and we are now trying to get them what they will need to launch a successful winter and spring offensive, because currently the map on the ground does not favor them.
So I'm curious to know, in this context, what the U.S. position is vis-a-vis India's stand. India is not necessarily always.
Our next story is about a sensational claim. You may have come across this one on the internet. Pfizer is engineering Wuhan virus mutations in a lab. There's a good chance you've seen this, because this claim is sweeping the internet. Many of you wrote to us about this. Is this a conspiracy theory, or is it a criminal pursuit waiting to be busted? Well, the idea is shocking, to say the least. The pandemic is not even over yet. The origins of the virus, although known to the world, are yet to be officially established. The Chinese are still suffering from the homemade virus, and they're still blocking access to the controversial Wuhan lab. In the middle of all of this, we have another lab theory. Let me first show you the report. It says Pfizer is building mutations in labs. What for? To make more effective vaccines. The claims have been made by Project Veritas. What is Project Veritas? It's an activist group known for conducting stings and ambush interviews. They say they conducted an undercover investigation. It features a Pfizer executive. His name is Jordan Tristan Walker. Project Veritas says he is the director of research and development at Pfizer. And this is the man I'm talking about. In the video that Project Veritas released, this man made some claims, and I have some quotes from what he said. One of the things we are exploring is why don't we just mutate COVID ourselves so we could preemptively develop new vaccines, right? So we have to do that. If you're going to do that, though, there's a risk of, as you can imagine, that's what he's saying, don't tell anyone. Promise you won't tell anyone. The way this experiment would work is that we put the virus in monkeys and we successively cause them to keep infecting each other, and we collect serial samples from them. It sounds like a horror movie already. In their report, Project Veritas mentioned something called directed evolution. What is directed evolution? It's a scientific method. It is said to be one of the most useful and widespread tools in basic and applied biology. It is used to create biological entities with certain desired traits. All this sounds like a redux of the lab theory, but is there any truth to these latest claims? Is this just a lab experiment blown out of proportion? Or do we have reason to be worried? Critics and fact-checkers, alleged fact-checkers, have their doubts about this report. One of the biggest loopholes, they say, is the protagonist himself, this man, Jordan Tristan Walker. The report came out on the 25th of January. In all these days, no one has been able to track down this man. There is no record of him. He hasn't issued a statement. He has not made any comment, nothing. No profile on Pfizer's website. Now, some people are pointing at a LinkedIn profile with the same name, but when we tried to check it earlier today, we found it doesn't even exist. Walker is apparently the director of research and development. Surely a man like him, a man in that position, cannot play ghost. The second loophole is the story in the story itself. In this video, Walker talks about a meeting at Pfizer. Apparently, the plan to quote-unquote optimize vaccines was being discussed there in that meeting. Was Walker present in the meeting? He did not say. He claimed that he'd heard about these plans. It doesn't quite add up. What about Pfizer? What does the company say about these claims? Well, they've issued a statement, and I have a copy. This is what it says. In the ongoing development of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, Pfizer has not conducted gain-of-function or directed evolution research. To meet US and global regulatory requirements for our oral treatment, Pfizer undertakes in vitro work to identify potential resistance mutations. Sounds complicated. This is what it means. Pfizer says that all it does is test new mutations with its drugs in a petri dish. Despite this, the story has not died yet. Also because Pfizer's own record is quite murky. From holding governments hostage for vaccines to demanding military assets as collateral, Pfizer has shown that it can go to any lengths to make the extra buck. Would mutating a virus be beyond the pale for a company such as this? Honestly, without proof, we wouldn't hazard a guess. Now let me tell you about a balloon that has hit the headlines. It's a Chinese balloon, and no, it's not in the news for being of poor quality. It's noteworthy because it's being called a spy balloon. At least that's what the Pentagon says. US officials are monitoring a suspected Chinese spy balloon. They say it is flying over sensitive sites in Montana for the last couple of days. Reports say President Joe Biden wanted to have it shot down, but his military said that could endanger people on the ground. There are a host of questions here. What exactly is a spy balloon? What is it doing in the US? And is this warfare technique new? Washington says the balloon is flying at an altitude well above commercial air traffic. They're confident that the balloon belongs to China. Some Montana residents took pictures that went viral on social media. They called it a quote-unquote big white circle in the sky. But why is it flying over Montana, of all places? Because this is home to one of America's 3 nuclear missile silo fields. It's at an Air Force base. The 2 other fields are in Wyoming and North Dakota. So how dangerous is the balloon? Washington has dismissed any significant threats. It says the balloon has limited capacity compared to a satellite. But Washington did not specify what it was doing to prevent information gathering. And the timing is significant. The balloon sighting comes days ahead of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Beijing. The purpose of the visit is to find common ground with China. The news of the balloon broke when CIA Director William Burns was speaking at an event. Do you know what he was speaking about? Burns said that China was, quote-unquote, the biggest geopolitical challenge Washington was facing. Clearly, the spy balloon could not have come at a worse time. Also, it hasn't come for the first time. Balloon sightings in American skies is an old story. History is full of examples. High-altitude balloons were first used for surveillance during the American Civil War in the 1860s. Men in hot air balloons with binoculars would track activity from a vantage point. Then, during the Second World War, the Allied powers used balloons as strategic weapons. Take Operation Outward, for instance. The British launched close to 100,000 outward balloons against Germany. And these were filled with hydrogen. They carried a trailing steel wire as payload. These destroyed high voltage power lines by inducing a short circuit. Then in the Cold War, guess who used the balloons? The United States. It deployed the balloons to gather intel from its rival, the Soviet Union. Some balloons were shot down. Some offered usable aerial photos. That was America's Project Genetrix. In another instance, Washington fitted high-altitude balloons with microphones. This was done to detect sound waves produced by Soviet atomic bomb tests. Reports say the US still uses balloons, but only in its own territory. So what makes these balloons so handy? Well, they're cheap, they're easy to use, and they can scan more territory from a lower altitude compared to satellites. Also, China wants to use that to its advantage. It wants to give Washington a taste of its own medicine, you could say. Just as the US went public with this, another nation entered the fray. Canada has confirmed a potential second incident. It detected a similar balloon in Canadian skies and said it was monitoring it. Well, we haven't heard the last of this. Let's just say it's a sign of the ballooning US-China rivalry. Speaking of rivalries, Israel and Palestine, Israel and Iran, more than rivalries, well, things are heating up. The last 2 weeks have seen tension and rockets. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rushed to France to meet President Emmanuel Macron. On the agenda was Iran. Why does Israel need French support on Iran? Also, why are they interested in the Sudan? That's the latest country with which Israel has announced a peace agreement. Our next report connects the dots. With a handshake and an embrace, that's how Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was welcomed by French President Emmanuel Macron to the Élysée Palace in Paris. This was the first meeting between the two leaders since Netanyahu returned to power late last year. The mood was much more somber behind closed doors. What was on the agenda? Iran, more specifically, its nuclear program. Israel has long opposed the 2015 nuclear deal. It was signed between Iran and several world powers. The list includes the US, the UK, France, Russia and China. The deal is known as JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran restricted its nuclear program and the West eased sanctions. This was the deal. In 2018, the United States walked out of it under President Trump. Currently, efforts to restart the deal are stuck in a deadlock. So why did Netanyahu choose to meet Macron over Iran? Because he wants Europe to increase its sanctions against Iran. He wants Europe to sanction Iran's Revolutionary Guards, a move that both France and Germany have resisted so far. Netanyahu is banking on Iran falling out of favor with Europe. That's because Iran is supplying drones to Russia in the war against Ukraine. Plus, it has cracked down on anti-hijab protests. Israel hopes all this will sour Iran's relationship with Europe, and Netanyahu has achieved some success. Because after the meeting, the French president called out Iran over what he called the headlong rush of its nuclear program. Iran is already locked in a tense escalation with Israel. Netanyahu's visit comes just days after a drone attack. An Iranian Defense Ministry facility in Isfahan came under attack. Iran says Israel was behind the attack. Meanwhile, violence is surging in the Israel-Palestine conflict as well. Last Friday, a Palestinian gunman shot dead 7 people outside a synagogue in East Jerusalem. It was the deadliest attack targeting civilians in more than a decade. And it came just a day after an Israeli raid in the West Bank killed 10 Palestinians. A day before that, an Israeli aircraft struck Gaza in response to rocket fire by the Palestinians. In January alone, 35 Palestinians and 7 Israelis have been killed. Washington is urging for calm. Before the meeting with Netanyahu, Macron's office said the president would, and I quote, reiterate the need for all sides to avoid measures likely to feed the cycle of violence. Pro-Palestinian activists have planned a stir in Paris on Saturday. They're unhappy over Macron's decision to host Netanyahu. Amid all this chaos, there's some good news for Israel from the Sudan. Israel and the Sudan have announced a peace agreement. It will be signed in the US later this year. The deal seeks to normalize ties between Israel and the Sudan. Israel has called it historic. Their foreign minister Eli Cohen was in Khartoum, the first visit by an Israeli official to the country. So after decades of non-recognition, the Sudan will have diplomatic ties with Israel.
חזרתי מביקור בחרטום בירת סודאן.
The Israeli foreign minister said, and I quote, Khartoum is remembered in Israel as the city where the Arab countries decided on the historic 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. We are building a new reality with the Sudanese, in which the 3 no's will become the 3 yeses. Yes to negotiations between Israel and Sudan, yes to recognition of Israel, and yes to peace between the states and between the peoples. With tensions on the rise, both with Palestine and Iran, Israel would be relieved that it has managed to turn at least one foe into friend. Let's shift our focus to oil, the world's most valuable commodity. Guess what oil companies were up to in 2022? They were making money like never before. The Ukraine war, the disrupted supply chains, the economic uncertainties, everything worked in their favor. Take this for instance, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell and Total Energies. What's common between these companies? Together they form the big oil club, meaning these firms are the top players in the global oil market. Now let me show you the kind of money they made. ExxonMobil recorded its highest ever profit of more than $55 billion in 2022. The last time it made anywhere close to that figure was back in 2008. Exxon's rival Chevron clocked more than $35 billion in profits. Shell, the UK-based oil company, recorded close to $40 billion in profits. Collectively, the big oil companies saw earnings of almost $200 billion in 1 year, $200 billion. How did they make this kind of money? Courtesy Russia and the war it's waging in Ukraine. Oil revenues took a big hit in 2020 and 2021. That was during the pandemic. The prices and demand had both fallen to an all-time low. At one point, oil had literally hit rock bottom. Then the Russian invasion happened. In February 2022, the West sanctioned Moscow. Russia hit back and cut off energy supplies to Europe. The global market was thrown off balance. Limited supplies meant prices shot up. You've seen all of this happen. In the initial months of the invasion, oil prices were well over the $100 per barrel mark. You know when something like this happened the last time? During the Iraq war in 2003, the conflict coincided with an increase in oil demand. And remember, Iraq held the world's second largest oil reserve in 2003, so oil companies exploited that wealth. And how? They actively took part in oil extraction and production in several parts. In return, they made hefty profits. ExxonMobil, for instance, it made more than $7 billion in profits in May 2003. It was a record then, $7 billion. In fact, oil companies got so rich that many said that was the whole purpose of the invasion, not to find the so-called weapons of mass destruction, but to help American oil companies. Interestingly, while the war ended a decade back, some big oil companies did not leave Iraq until recently. And now there's another war and more money. But oil companies are also facing flack. They're being slammed by some governments. Lawmakers are calling the profits obscene.
Oil companies' record profits today are not because they're doing something new or innovative. Their profits are a windfall of war. The windfall from the brutal conflict that's ravaging Ukraine and hurting tens of millions of people around the globe.
In the UK, for instance, a windfall tax has been introduced. This is a tax on the profits that oil companies make. This is in addition to the taxes they already pay. But you see what the governments are doing here. Instead of pushing for a green transition, they just want a slice of the oil profits. And how does any of it help the people? They're still paying higher energy bills. So much for the green push. Summits are lined up every year. Leaders pledge to reduce the use of fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency says high oil prices could be a boon for the renewable energy sector. But that's not how any of it is playing out. Here's a statistic. Since 2016, banks have given loans worth $2.5 trillion for energy activities, $2.5 trillion. Do you know how much of this money has gone to renewable energy? Just 7%. So here's where we are at. Oil revenues keep flowing, demand remains steady. Green energy, on the other hand, is still somewhere in the future. And the priority for governments right now is to share the spoils. Once upon a time, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British monarchy's rule was so widespread that it was always sunny in at least one of their territories. Well, that was then. Today, the world has changed. For the first time in decades, Britain no longer has a queen, and it seems many of its former colonies no longer wish to have a king or queen for that matter. In 2021, Barbados made headlines. It was a Commonwealth nation with Queen Elizabeth as its head. It dropped the Queen, became a republic, and announced its own president. Guess who attended the transition ceremony? Prince Charles, who's now the King of Britain. Barbados moved on. Britain got a king. And apart from the British monarch, he's the head of state of 14 countries, 1-4. This list includes Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. These countries are known as Commonwealth realms. They're different from the Commonwealth of Nations. This group, the Commonwealth of Nations, has 54 countries, and these countries were once part of the British Empire. This list includes India. Yes, 7 decades after independence, what is India doing in this group? Getting out of here seems nobody's priority. Many arguments are made in favor of remaining a Commonwealth country. We say India should reconsider. But that's not a point that I'm going to dwell on today, because today I want to talk about Australia. The sun may still be shining on the Commonwealth realms, but it's certainly dimming in Australia. Canberra is removing the British monarchy from its banknotes, specifically its new $5 bill. So instead of King Charles, this note will feature an indigenous design. Australia says it honors the quote-unquote culture and history of the first Australians. But the king is not being dumped altogether. He's likely to appear on coins. The coins currently bear the image of the late Queen Elizabeth. So Australia is breaking away from its colonial past, one step at a time. The government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is working in that direction. Soon after he took office, the Prime Minister created a new position, the position of the Assistant Minister for the Republic. And this led to speculation. Was Australia going to push for a referendum to become a republic? Hasn't happened yet, but it did happen some time back. This is an old debate. In 1999, a referendum like this was held. But Australian voters chose to keep the British monarch as their head of state. What explains this sympathy with Britain? And Australia is not an exception. Since the Second World War, only 20 former colonies have removed the British monarch. Only 20 countries have removed the Queen as the head of state and replaced her with a president. This includes countries like India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Then, during the 1970s, many Caribbean islands decided to leave the Commonwealth realm, like Trinidad and Tobago, Dominica, Guyana. In 1992, it was Mauritius. Barbados waited till 2021, like we mentioned earlier. What about the others? Discontent is brewing in many of them. People are unhappy that they're still part of the monarchy. Last year, Prince William and his wife Kate toured the Caribbean. The visit was to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. The couple was met with protests. From Jamaica to Belize to the Bahamas, it was the same story. And while people here want to get over their colonial hangover, there are outliers like New Caledonia, a bunch of islands in the South Pacific. This is a French territory. Even today, more than a century after the French colonized them. In 2021, a referendum was held. Should New Caledonia seek independence from France? The answer was no. An overwhelming 96% voted to say that they wanted to remain a part of France. How did these far-flung islands become French territory? Napoleon's nephew colonized New Caledonia in the 19th century. It is 10 time zones ahead of Paris. It hosts a French military base. The territory is known as the Pebble. It is of strategic importance to France, and it's now part of a wider tussle for influence in the region between the West and China. What do these stories tell you? Colonial hangovers are not easy to shed. The political colonization may have ended for most, but cultural colonization is something that we're still fighting. Some countries are shedding the baggage, one $5 bill at a time. Others want to remain tied to the coattails of the big brother. It's Friday night. I'm sure many of you have weekend plans that include Netflix and a password that you've shared with your friends and family. That's what I want to talk about tonight, your Netflix password. First, listen to this. Love is an addiction. Love is sharing a password. Not my words. This is what Netflix said back in 2017. It tweeted this. And the thing with tweets is that people remember them. And they can be dug out at just the right time. Netflix has been working on a plan for some time now. The plan is to increase its stagnated subscriber base. You'd think that requires a major marketing push. Well, that's a traditional approach. But Netflix faces a unique challenge. It already has many unofficial subscribers, about 100 million of them. These users don't pay for the streaming service. They've enjoyed this luxury for years. Honestly, all of us have. Here's how it has worked so far. You have a friend who is a Netflix subscriber. All you need from this friend is a password to log into Netflix. Then you can enjoy Netflix content for free or pay a nominal sum to that friend for lending their password. That's entirely between you and your friend, how that works out. Now, this scenario assumes that just two people can operate a single Netflix account. But from Netflix's point of view, the reality is far more grim. Imagine one Netflix password or account being used by 5 people, which means 5 people enjoy content, but the company gets money only for one. Here's where the 100 million figure comes in. Netflix estimates that about 100 million people use the streaming service without paying for it. And it wants to crack down on this practice. Here's the plan. A single account will be accessible to people living in the household. What happens if you log in from a different location? The primary account holder will get a one-time password, which will be valid for 15 minutes. Now, suppose you get that password. Then you'll have uninterrupted access to the streaming service, but only for 7 days. What happens after 7 days? Netflix will start charging more money from the primary subscriber, which may spell the end of your password sharing arrangement. Let's say you figure out a way to continue using Netflix without paying for it. It's going to get difficult and it may not last. Because we may not realize this, but Netflix knows more about us than we think it does. It will track your IP address, your device ID, and account activity to make sure only one person living in one household can access one account. The plan, by the way, has been proposed before, but it never took off given the resistance it faced. Now it may finally be implemented, because 2022 was a particularly brutal year for the streaming giant. It lost more than 200,000 subscribers due to fierce competition. Those are numbers from just the first quarter of 2022. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Netflix suspended streaming in Russia. It lost 700,000 subscribers in one go, 7 lakh. In the second quarter, it lost nearly 1 million subscribers. That was the proverbial last straw. The company's stocks came tumbling down, a fall of 26%. It wiped out $40 billion from Netflix's kitty. They had to take some harsh decisions. The crackdown on password sharing will help Netflix kill 2 birds with one stone, increase the subscriber base and boost revenues. Or so they hope. But users may not play ball. The move may alienate loyal subscribers. It may also anger potential future subscribers. After all, why will people pay for content which is just a Google search away? Sure, the streaming experience may not be as good as Netflix, but at least some of the content is free. Well, that's how a lot of consumers think. Also, what happens when you're traveling? Will Netflix start charging more money just because the account is being accessed from a different location? Will college goers not be able to use Netflix with the credentials of their parents? And what happened to all the talk of sharing passwords being a symbol of love? Netflix is trying to figure it out. Let us know what you think about this. Our next story is about 3 words and maybe some alliteration. China, cows, cloning. Do you know what I'm talking about? Maybe another clue. China is having a cloning movement. Scientists in China have successfully cloned 3 super cows. Yes, that's what they're being called. Why? Because they can produce unusually high amounts of milk. It is being hailed as a breakthrough for China's dairy industry. But is it indeed? And did China need one? Our next report tells you.
Imagine the perfect dairy cow. For years, she's produced gallon upon gallon of the best milk. She gives birth easily and stays healthy. But she eventually reaches the end of her reproductive life. So what if you want a cow that goes on producing liters of milk forever? Well, you create one. Well, that seems to be what China's solution to this problem. They claim to have cloned 3 super cows successfully. Now what's cloning? In simple words, it's nothing but biological copying. It's a complex process. It helps copy the genetic or inherited traits of the donor animal, similar to twins sharing the same DNA. Clones have the same genes as the donor animal. This can introduce the natural positive characteristics into the herd quickly. And this is not new. People have cloned all kinds of animals. Extinct animals have been cloned back to life. It sounds a little creepy, but people even clone their adored pets after their death. And researchers have been cloning livestock since 1996. Cattle, swine, sheep, and goats have all been successfully cloned. Chickens and other poultry, though, have not been cloned yet. Now to the cloned calves in China. They were bred by scientists from the Northwest Agriculture and Forestry University, and they were born in the Ningxia region on January 23rd. But what makes them super cows? Well, they were cloned from highly productive cows which can produce unusually high amounts of milk. They belong to the Holstein Friesian breed, which originated in the Netherlands. These cows are capable of producing 18 tons of milk per year, which translates to about 100 tons of milk in their lifetimes. Now that's a lot of milk. To give you an idea, it's almost 1.7 times the amount of milk an average cow in the US produced in 2021. The cloning of these cows is being hailed by China as a breakthrough for its dairy industry. But why did they need to clone cows in the first place? To reduce the country's dependence on imported cow breeds. As many as 70% of China's dairy cows are imported from overseas. And not just that, there is a dearth of highly productive cows in China. Only 5 in 10,000 cows can produce 100 tons of milk in their lifetimes. Sure, this makes them a crucial resource for breeding, but such cows are rarely identified until the end of their lives. And this makes the entire process all the more difficult. Cloning has allowed China to preserve the very best cows, and in what scientists say is an economically feasible way. So how did they do it? The scientists made 120 cloned embryos, which came from the ear cells of the highly productive cows. Once completed, they were placed in surrogate cows. But China, of course, doesn't plan to stop with these 3 calves. The country is now planning to build an army of these super cows. The aim is to spend about 2 to 3 years to build this herd, and it will comprise of no less than 1,000 super cows. And this Milky Way army will be put to good use. It will reduce China's risk of being choked by supply chain disruptions. But while this perfectly satisfies China's current need, is it causing environmental damage in the long run? What are the risks of cloning? Problems seen in animals born naturally can happen more often in clones, simply because of problems in the early stages of the embryo. In fact, calf and lamb clones tend to have more problems at birth as compared to other livestock. There is another issue, namely the large offspring syndrome. Sometimes the cloned fetus grows so large in the uterus, it causes problems for the animal acting as a surrogate. Not only this, because cloning is not a natural process, there can be abnormalities in the embryos. This could lead to miscarriages or death just after birth. And cloning does not have a 100% success rate. Not all pregnancies after cloning meet a fruitful end. This means that several surrogate and egg donor animals may be used in the process. The process of cloning can often put animals through undue pain and harm. Several animals may have to suffer and die in order to produce one healthy, perfect cow. But this hasn't stopped China. It has made significant progress in animal cloning in recent years. Last year, a cloning company in China created the world's first cloned Arctic wolf. In 2017, China produced cloned cattle with increased resistance to bovine tuberculosis, which is a risk to cattle in many countries. And let's not forget, farmers breed clones in many countries, including the United States. They try and add traits such as high milk production or disease resistance into the gene pool. Cloning is fairly pervasive, but the ethical concern behind it has not reduced, and no one can deny the harm caused to the environment in the long run. Messing with nature has its drawbacks, but none that can deter China, it seems. So what's next for the superpower? After super cows, will it be superhumans?
And now it's time to wrap up with Vantage shots, images that tell the story. SpaceX launched the Falcon 9 rocket from Florida. Around 9 minutes after the launch, the rocket's first stage touched down on SpaceX's Of Course I Still Love You drone ship. Look up the name, it is real. Of course I still love you. Back on Earth, in the US, winter is likely to last more than 6 weeks, says who? The world's most famous groundhog. In Scotland, people are bidding winters goodbye. Women joined a fire festival for the first time ever to mark the end of the Christmas season. And in Congo, Pope Francis was welcomed by young people with a traditional dance. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
3, 2, ignition, 1, liftoff.
Beagle's pitching downrange. Falcon 9 is supersonic.
Just heard the call out that Falcon 9 is supersonic, meaning that it is traveling faster than the speed of the final burn that slows the rocket down to help it land on the drone ship.
I see a shadow on my stage. And so, no matter how you measure, it's 6 more weeks of winter weather.
Punxsutawney Phil, ladies and gentlemen.
Nirmala ji, thank you so much for giving us this first budget interview to a streaming service and a private news channel. Through this interview, you will reach the length and breadth of the country through all our News 18 channels, CNBC TV 18, CNN News 18, News 18 India, and a slew of digital properties, moneycontrol.com, firstpost, and news18.com. Thank you so much for this. My first question, this is your 5th budget. You were navigating 2 epochal events in the last couple of years. One was the ongoing pandemic and its impact, and the other was the war in Ukraine. What I would like to understand from you is what was going on in the mind of Nirmala Sitharaman and, how she was dealing with policy making in these last 5 historic years.
Starting with a very difficult question, because difficult not for any other reason, but to capture the experiences, the, as I say, anubhav, going through that, and also to look back at it now when you're probably slightly out of it. is very difficult to describe in, let's say, a short, brief answer.
I can understand.
But yet, if you have to really capture it, I had no precedent before me to handle such a situation. There were no given templates. There were no examples to follow. And there were no theories which would have worked in such context. So essentially we were going by continuous conversation with all kinds of stakeholders. Those who have directly some thing to say about the industry and its suffering, MSME and its suffering, or even those who are observing it with a more discerning eye. So we had to engage in conversation continuously with all people, take their view, weigh it for ourselves to see which one is all right, which is more suitable for us and which is not. Yes. And also take courage in saying it may not work out for us in one particular way, because eventually somewhere all this has got to be answerable. And therefore I think I would immensely recall the ways in which Honorable PM led the conversation with us. He would never tire himself from meeting us. He would never say, not today. So with all necessary precautions taken for COVID, following the protocol, we would still meet and talk about things. But eventually, whatever has been at that time decided and put out as schemes, one thing which was not so much relevant for dealing with the pandemic itself, but yet had to be done, was not to let go the opportunity to continue the reform process. Yes. So that was carried on. But we may do so many things. We may have a stable leadership, clear-headed leadership which stands by us and gives us the guidance under the Prime Minister. And we may come up with the proposals and also launch some specific schemes at that time to benefit, to give relief and so on. Eventually it is the way in which the people of India have absorbed it all. You know, absorbed it and found best ways to go around it with this kind of a succor which is coming from the government, or some hand-holding which is coming from the government. May not be adequate, but so the credit goes to the people of India for having so been in clued position with the government's, every decision making, and kept pace with it all. And that is why today we are where we are. Entirely the way in which people of India have absorbed whatever has been done from the government side and put it to effect in the ground.
Well, you make a very important point. I think you never gave up on reforms in the last so many years. This come what may, pandemic, war in Ukraine, and that I must concede. I clearly remember that many experts and economists at that time panned the government, panned India, that we were not doing enough for stimulus in the COVID period. And I remember they cited examples of Western economies, European economies, saying that we should at least give 10 to 20% of GDP. That's the bare minimum we should do. Now in hindsight, do you think that it was good to ignore that advice and be tight-fisted, and that is showing up today?
Yes, that is why in answering earlier your question, we had to do our homework for every such input which came in at that time. Why? We could have always said, no, this is what appeals to us, and we would have gone ahead. No, but we had to consider every such advice which came in, and also go through the depths of what it would mean, how will it be executed, whether it can really bear the results and so on, only because whether we choose one way or not, we should know why we have not chosen a particular way and be able to justify saying, our understanding was this, and that's why we didn't take it. Today I have the advantage of looking back at it and say, good that I didn't take it, because the results would have been very different. But the fact remains that we went through every one of the suggestions with...
Nirmala ji, if I look at this budget, coming to this budget, the central theme, and you've elaborated, you've articulated it in your speech subsequently as well, but I would still like to ask this question, that there is a big push to capital expenditure on one hand, on the other you've also given a lot of money into the hands of the middle class and the rich, so that there is a consumption boom. All this while keeping the fiscal discipline in place, as you had promised. 5.9%, so that's giving some comfort to everyone. What I want to understand is, what are the few outcomes, big outcomes that you're looking at from this budget?
If well executed, if the states and the center work together, I expect tourism to really see a sea change. Flow of people coming in both from one other states and also from abroad. It should actually be a good way of keeping the economy active. If that is going to be this year and also medium term, I also see the momentum that PM Vikas scheme is going to come up with. Because what it does, at least from the way in which I've done this work on understanding that scheme and to see how best it can be tailored, it touches that segment which is sort of self-employed, which has skills, which may be traditional skills, but which are very productively used, and that itself has a huge market, niche market of its own. If by launching PM Vikas, we will be able to touch upon a large section, not confined to any particular few castes, which go by the description Vishwakarma. But we are including everybody who uses his hand with some tools, produces things. That's a huge layer which doesn't get covered under A scheme or B scheme or C scheme.